Super. So next on our agenda, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming and introducing our next keynote speaker, Yves-François Blanchet, leader of the Bloc Québécois. And before I turn the microphone over to you, Monsieur Blanchet, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our gratitude for the hard work and dedication of the Bloc Québécois ag critic, Yves Perron. I see he's there on your left. Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much.
Of the ag sector. Following your remarks, Mr. Blanchet, I understand you'll be taking some questions from the floor as well, so the mic is yours. Thank you.
Bien, bonjour tout le monde.
Hello, everyone, and I am reassured when I see that many of you have headsets, given the very high risk of my making mistakes if I have to speak English, because we easily make mistakes when talking about very specific topics such as this. Now, you'll all understand this may be a little self-serving, but I will also salute the work done by Yves Perron. When I asked him to take on the issue of agriculture, I knew that I was putting it in the hand of the most pugnacious among our members. There are many of you who get calls from Yves, but that is nothing compared to the calls that I get from him. He keeps insisting on being heard. He defends your interests. I find it remarkable myself, and I want to thank him for his contributions. Now, that being said, I have been a part of a government in the past because the odds of the Bloc Québécois being the next government of Canada are very slight, but I have been in government in Quebec, and at the time we used to say, and people from the UPA will find it funny, we used to say that a Minister of Agriculture cannot survive without the support of the Liberals. And I guess that the current minister probably gets along with the UPA, and that tells you just how important it is to ensure that we take agriculture into account in our daily lives, and especially in political life. It tells you just how important what happens in the regions is, what happens in the regions, what happens in our plates, whether we are in Montreal, in Toronto, or in Vancouver. What you do, what you contribute is essential. If we look at the news often dictates the themes that we're going to look at, whether it's Roxham Road or whether it is Chinese interference and so on. Those are the topics of the day because the papers have decided that they're the topics of the day, but there are other issues that we don't deal with that are just as important and that may be even more important over the long term. The fact that you're all here today forces us, and this is quite healthy, forces us to concentrate on a topic that may not be making headlines, but that is just as fundamental. So let's talk about 5 different points that we can have an exchange of ideas about. The first, and it's going to be fairly brief, but of course it's essential, the issue of labor. And I want to remind you, and it wouldn't have cost nothing politically if it had been done, because we've been working on this for years. We said that we should shorten the procedure for these checkups to say whether the temporary foreign worker is going to take on the jobs of Canadians, as if the federal government had forgotten that we're dealing with a labor shortage. That doesn't mean we don't do any checking into that at all, but we should lighten that burden. We know that farms in Quebec and Canada as a whole are businesses that are producing for their nearby markets. These are businesses that know their reality, that know their context, and they are businesses that have fewer resources to put into management and administration as a whole, and especially not for paperwork. So could we not come up with some measure that would allow for these work permits to be renewed automatically year after year? You could have a 3-year permit, and then after the first year you can add on the fourth and tack on the fifth after the second, so that there is some it's something you can count on. Or could we not allow some companies to work together because of seasonal aspects to working on farms, so that workers in Quebec could spend some time in one business and some time in at another farm, depending on what the requirements are? Are these solutions to that are the be-all and end-all? No, probably not. But these are solutions that at least deserve to be discussed. You know, this is not a partisan issue at all. These are solutions that are being put forward with some humility, but that would allow for us to help farms. And I think that the government must be open to this conversation. We need to have these proposals move forward, and then Parliament could take them on, and from that point forward, they're no longer in our hands. And then the second theme is the environment. Now, the environment means many things. It means that the planet as a whole and all of our societies must adjust to a concern that affects daily lives of all of our citizens. For many of us, the environment means being able to communicate the fact that farm businesses, and especially small farms that are on a more human scale, are sensitive to these environmental issues and are often owned and managed by people who are often much more interested in the environment than the Minister of the Environment themselves. Now, we don't often say it because the work that is required of farms in order to meet all of our expectations environmentally, it require investments, huge investments. They require funding. And we're telling these farms, while you're at it, for those who are under supply management, and God knows supply management is important in Quebec, well, we're going to cut back 2%, 3%, 3.25% of your incomes coming from the market, because we're admitting foreign products on our markets. And you're going to have compensation, but to get that compensation, you're going to have to invest to meet environmental standards. But that is illogical, and it's been said and repeated. We've said we need some goals that are long-term goals that are clearly stated and that everyone agrees on for these programs. Now, another theme, food resiliency. In Quebec, we used to talk about food sovereignty, but when Yves came forward and said that in our own program we should talk about food resiliency, I was quite pleased. Not because I'm not sovereigntist, because you probably know I sometimes hope for sovereignty in Quebec, but it was a type of confusion of meaning when we talked about food sovereignty. The fact that we want to be self-sufficient in our food production, that wasn't about sovereignty, that was about having an approach that would allow us to maximize the consumption of our own products on our own markets, which seems completely legitimate. And so talking about resiliency is really talking about sustainability and not sovereignty in that case. And the other aspect, which is quite fundamental, is the aspect of reciprocity. I mentioned it earlier. Quebec businesses are smaller than U.S. companies as a whole, and U.S. companies overall are smaller than Chinese companies. We've seen these mega buildings that China is looking at building to produce pork in cities in China. We know that businesses in Canada and moreover in Quebec are much smaller than that, and they are subjected to rules, standards, level of security, food safety that are a lot more rigorous than many of these businesses that benefit from economies of scales because they're often much larger and they also have a better climate. So we're imposing rules on food products in the Canadian market. These rules serve to ensure public safety and security. But our neighbors who compete with us, they only think about bigger volumes, and they're not subject to these same rules and regulations. And as long as we don't have reciprocity in especially these phytosanitary rules that impose behaviors on farms, Canadian and Quebec farms will be disadvantaged unless we have this reciprocity. So we need to have some equity in that, and only in that context can we open up markets. You can't open a market because our players are disadvantaged because of their scales, and we are dealing with an issue that is very close to resiliency here because we have to look at this issue over the longer term. And finally, I have to say how very proud I am to see C-282 progressing in Parliament. Now, I have to say that I'm hopeful. C-182 is about protecting supply management in future trade negotiations. And the minister has told Yves and myself personally that they support wholeheartedly this bill. Well, that's fine. It's going to move along. It's going to go to committees and then a second reading. And then suddenly, it falls off the books because we have an election coming up. And we don't want that to happen. The minister has said that she supports it. Well, we have to proceed quickly. And we're not going to go through the very same thing as we did last time. We've studied it already. It should come back to the floor. It should be adopted, and it should become law in our country. We should and we must protect the future of supply management. This bill will give us some assurances about quality assurance, about the fact that these prices will remain reasonable. This is an important tool that has been very successful. And in that same spirit, we have to broaden our thinking. Maybe we should look at broadening this notion beyond just supply management. We need to think as a state about what we are negotiating when we are negotiating a trade agreement. I was talking about this with Marcel Groslo just a few minutes ago, and I salute him because we've met at various times over years. And in the field of culture, that has always been taken into account. And I used to be with ADISC in Quebec when we were negotiating an exemption for cultural expressions in trade. And I think that for our social policy, for our fiscal policy, for our environmental policy, and for our agricultural policy, each state must protect its own ability to protect its own model. The companies that are within its purview, because farms and agriculture are essential because they serve to identify and preserve the identity of communities. These are a reflection of the choices that are made by our population. This is something that we need to think about for the longer term, and we've seen it for cultural diversity. It's been done. It's been done for Indigenous issues, for other issues, this right to self-determination by Indigenous peoples. We know that these types of international treaties can move forward, can be brought up to the very top levels at the UN, so that we can have the tools that we must have to ensure that our models are kept in place so that we can continue to produce. These are the 5 big themes that serve to develop our vision of agriculture, firstly for Quebec, because that is what the Bloc Québécois concentrates on first and foremost. But I am absolutely convinced that for a great number of these issues, and we're here to show it, to live it, for these issues that are purely Canadian, purely Quebec issues, some of these we have in common, and whatever the future may hold, that will remain the case, and we will continue to collaborate on these issues. So that being said, if some of you now have questions for me, I will do my best to answer them as best I can.
Bonjour, M. Blanchet. Mon nom est Paul.
Hello, Mr. Blanchet. I'm Paul Doyon from the UPA. Now, you talked about the issue of standards, reciprocity, and for imported products. It seems to me, I'm a little old now, and it seems to me that we've been talking about this for at least 25 years. So how can we help you to achieve this goal? Well, that's an interesting question. You know, every time we deal with something that is unsuccessful politically, we're asked, well, what are you going to do if the other side doesn't go along with you? Well, we're living in a democracy, and in a democracy, some things end up working. The more people you have saying the same thing in the same words, there are some issues that are currently being imposed on the Prime Minister. He's going to have to do things that he doesn't enjoy doing. Why is he going to have to do these things? Because he has no other choice. So why is it that Yves can put forward C-282? Because it was quite clear that there was a very, very broad consensus about this. And politically not doing it was going to be more costly. So when dealing with fundamental issues, I think that we need to make sure that everyone who is concerned about these same issues in the same way at the same time express it, so that especially a minority government has to take this into account. We need to recognize that this is a challenge. Our neighbor is not open to our views. They tend to want to protect their own markets, especially when it comes to milk, when it comes to softwood lumber, and they're pretty keen to close the door to who they pretend is their partner. And it's only because there's some pressure. People look at the map of Joe Biden's victory in the last election. You just look at that map and you know that the northern region, the dairy-producing region in the U.S., they all turned Democratic, and he's going to want to protect them. You know that. All you need to do is look at the map. So we need to work. We need to be. We've been patient, and you know, the best system is democracy, so we need to work over time. And with a minority government and with a balance of power held by people who believe in your views, that's how you achieve success.
Hi there. I'm Tyler Fulton. I'm with the Canadian Cattle Association. And you can probably expect that I disagree on the approach of Bill 282. In particular, I think if you surveyed export-oriented commodities, they would cite as a benefit of exporting their commodity, greater food security within Canada, because it adds capacity that creates more resilience. So I want to say explicitly, in its current form, where it where the bill explicitly cites supply managed commodities and nothing else, I think it it serves as a wedge issue within agriculture and doesn't serve the benefits of all of agriculture in Canada. That's not to say the supply management doesn't have value. I think we can all likely agree that that's the case. But I think that that taking one thing off of the negotiating table is the wrong approach. Thank you.
You will allow me to answer mostly in French because the ice is not thick enough for me. Vous avez mentionné la chose.
So you mentioned this by talking about the impact on export markets. I think that what we need to seek is a balance between the capacity and the willingness of various agricultural sectors to feed our own population using criteria as parameters, food safety, public interest issues that are their own, especially in the dairy industry, and other sectors are based on exports, when we know that. Now, my fear is that one sector be sacrificed at the for the benefit of the other. If we don't grant some protection to supply management, to the Quebec and Canadian model for dairy production, then that model will not be sustained. The standards are going to have to lower. These standards are going to be closer to our neighbors' standards, and our ability to compete on our own market is going to be weakened. Yes, some sectors can benefit from a greater ability to export, but having just one model that doesn't take into account the specificity of agriculture, especially in Quebec. But I do concede that we can develop positions that will not serve against some sectors in favor of others. We need to avoid this wedge that you mentioned.
Martin Caron.
Martin Caron, the UPA chair. I was there to congratulate you on C-282, first and foremost because the other parties have supported it, but you are the one who put it forward as a party. And about the discussion that we've just had, the question that was just raised, here at the CFA, we've always had a dream, and our dream was to have farms all over our country, and the supply management system allows for that and doesn't hinder our ability to export. Quite the opposite. Now, Mr. Blanchet, I'd like to talk about the issues that you've talked about at the Canadian and the Quebec level. We have issues with transportation in Western Canada. We have in the East similar issues like climate change and the environment and so on. But the big issue that we have is for young farmers who want to take on our farms. This is an issue we've been talking about at the CFA, and this is about financial support. Several parties have come here and have told us how important food and agri-food and agriculture are. Now, I have a very specific question. How do we get more funding for to help agriculture and the agri-food sector? Because that's what we need. We need much greater support, given the great role that we play. Well, I have three things to say about that. Firstly, some of the interests in Western Canada are different from those of Quebec, but that's the case for other issues as well. When I meet people, for instance, francophones from outside of Quebec, we have meetings and we realize that even though we might be divided in public opinion because people believe that our objectives don't mesh, but we can have a lot in common. And secondly, the merit of C-282 was it may not have been as much of a priority to me as it was to Yves, but he insisted so much that we acted as quickly as he wanted us to act. Some of us had doubts, but he proved to us that we were wrong, that we needed to move forward fast. So we followed Yves' plan, and now we have a very reasonable chance of having this succeed. Now, because I didn't want to speak too long, I talked about 5 topics, but I didn't talk about young farmers. Now, the issue of the size of farms in Quebec means that we manage them differently. We are not in the conventional industrial model where you would have management teams and a big company. No, we have farms that are smaller, with a smaller management team, and these farms often still have that willingness to transmit the farm to the next generation. And there is that willingness, but the financial ability to transfer the farm is very, very difficult. It's difficult for a young family to take on that debt. So if we want to preserve our model, we need to reduce our constraints to having access to this this funding, so that the banks and so that all of our, so that we can have a true valuation of the farm, so that we can give our next generation the tools that they require to take on the farm. Now, I understand that I should be leaving now. Thank you to all of you.